Chapter 7. Holt dropped Abelard's rein and began to run. The horse would follow along, he knew. Another scream came through the trees. The first had been a shout of fear and alarm. This one had anger mixed in. He ran faster, the sax knife and quiver thumping on his hip and shoulder as his feet hit the ground. Belatedly, he realized that he would have been better off remounting and riding Abelard. But no sooner had the thought occurred than he burst into a clearing where a small thatched farmhouse stood, smoke curling lazily from its chimney, several cows moving uneasily in the fenced-off paddock beside the house. Another defiant scream, then a man's voice raised in anger and the unmistakable sound of a blow. A gasp of pain from the woman. "My husband will kill you for that!" she cried. "Your husband's dead," a sneering voice replied, "and you'll join him if you don't do as you're told. You and the baby." Holt heard a quick sob of grief from the woman at these words. Seething with rage, he hit the farmhouse door with his shoulder and burst into the dim room inside. He took in the details instantly. A woman crouched in the far corner, close to the cooking hearth, her arms spread protectively over a cradle. Gerald stood over her, his hand raised to hit her again, frozen in the act as the door crashed back on its leather hinges. To Holt's left, Cord was rummaging through a chest, hurling clothes and household pieces in all directions as he searched for items of value. He too froze at the sudden appearance of the ranger. Then recognition dawned as he made out the dark bearded face. "You!" he snarled. "What are you doing here?" He didn't wait for an answer, but lunged to his feet, drawing the cheap sword that he wore at his waist and surging across the room to swing a downward cut at Holt. The ranger's actions were instinctive. He sidestepped the savage sword stroke, swaying to his right, and simultaneously drew the sax knife with his left hand. He was bringing the big knife up to a defensive position when Cord's momentum drove him onto the blade. Cord looked down in horror as the razor-sharp, hardened steel slid easily through the rusty links of his chainmail vest. He gasped, and blood welled out of his mouth. His eyes went dull, and his knees gave way. Holt jerked the knife free of the falling body and spun to face Gerald, who was still trying to take in the rapid sequence of events. Then Gerald's eyes hardened, and he drew his own sword, stepping deliberately forward, not rushing as Cord had done, presenting the sword point first and letting it sway back and forth, threatening the smaller man who faced him. The woman dropped back on her haunches beside the cot, watching in wide-eyed horror as the scene unfolded before her. Gerald advanced another pace. Holt switched the sax to his right hand and withdrew warily. He was confident that he could handle the soldier, in spite of the apparent disparity in their weapons. Swordsmen often underestimated the lethal potential of a sax knife, he knew. Still, he was prepared to let Gerald make the first move, and so draw him into closer range, where the sax would be effective. Gerald feinted with the blade. Holt, watching his eyes, saw no commitment there and ignored the movement. His apparent calm infuriated Gerald. Holt saw the hot anger welling up in his eyes. "You're a dead man, Arate," Gerald said through clenched teeth. Holt smiled. "That's been said before, yet here I am." He took another pace backward, conscious of Cord's still body on the beaten earth floor of the farmhouse, just beside and behind him. Gerald darted the sword blade out at him. This time it was no feint, and Holt was ready for it. He flicked it aside with the sax, the two blades ringing together for a second. The speed and ease of his response raised a worm of doubt in Gerald's mind. He had the longer weapon, He had the advantage. Yet this bearded figure in the strange mottled cloak seemed completely at ease. He was thinking about this when Arate, as he knew him, lunged forward with the short, gleaming sax. Gerald leapt backwards, yelping in surprise, and managed to swipe his sword across in a clumsy parry, just in time. For the first time, he realized that he might be outmatched. He was about to drop his weapon and plead for mercy when something totally unexpected happened. Holt felt an iron grip on his left ankle, then the leg was jerked from under him, sending him sprawling awkwardly on the farmhouse floor. As he fell, he turned and found himself looking into Cord's face. The eyes were filled with hatred, the lips curled back in one last snarl of triumph. With his final breath, Cord had managed to take revenge on the small man who had ruined everything for them. Now the eyes went blank as the life left his body. Gerald, who was never too quick on the uptake, saw that his opponent was, for the moment, helpless before him. With a cry of triumph, he raised the sword in both hands, point down, and stepped forward, preparing to drive it into the prone body on the floor. Holt struggled to rise, but knew it was too late. The gleaming sword point began to descend. Then a figure came from nowhere and crashed into Gerald, clinging to him and knocking him sideways, sending the sword spinning out of his grasp. Holt dodged sideways as the weapon fell close to him, then realized what had happened. The woman had launched herself at Gerald, landing on his back and clinging there like a wildcat as she raked at his face and eyes with her nails. The thief staggered under the impact, turning so that the two of them crashed into the kitchen table, sending it spinning, then cannoned into the wall, smashing halfway through the close-woven willow sticks daubed with mud. Unable to dislodge the grim, clinging figure on his back, Gerald twisted so that he was facing her and, drawing his heavy-bladed dagger, struck out desperately at her. She cried out in pain and released her grip, falling back, hands clutching at the savage wound in her side. Blood covered her hands instantly, soaking the white cotton material of her shift as she sank to one knee. Then Holt was upon Gerald, grasping the man's knife hand and forcing it upwards, while he drew his throwing knife and rammed it deep into Gerald's body. Gerald gave a grunt of pain. The heavy dagger fell from his hand, and for a moment he was supported only by Holt's grip on his right wrist. Then, as the ranger released him, he sagged to his knees, looking up at Holt, his eyes showing shock at the fact that this was the way his life was to end. He fell over sideways, his hands desperately trying to stem the flow of blood from the wound. Holt stood warily for a second, making sure that Gerald was truly finished. His recent experience with Cord had made him careful. Then, satisfied that Gerald wasn't about to rally for another attack, he knelt quickly beside the stricken woman. Her face was white and drawn with the savage pain of the wound. Holt looked at the amount of blood she had lost already and knew she had no chance of surviving. She looked up at the stranger who had tried to save her, whom she had saved by her desperate attack on Gerald. She saw the sadness in the dark eyes looking down at her and knew the truth. She was dying. Yet there was something she had to know. My husband, she managed to gasp. Is he really dead? Holt hesitated. He was tempted to lie to her, to comfort her, but he knew he could never carry off the lie. He nodded. Yes, he said, you'll soon be with him. He saw the sudden look of anguish in her face as her eyes turned towards the cot in the corner of the room. Our son, she said, and coughed blood as she spoke. Then she made a massive effort and recovered herself. Don't leave him with the villagers. He'll have no life with them. We're strangers here. They'll work him to death. Holt nodded. Daniel and his wife were new arrivals in the area. They wouldn't have friends in the village to take care of their infant son. An orphan would be a burden to most villagers. His only worth would be as a worker, a virtual slave. I'll take care of him, he said gently, and the woman reached up and seized his hand in a surprisingly strong grip. Promise me, she said, and he placed his other hand over hers. I promise. She studied his eyes for several seconds and seemed to find reassurance there. She released his hand and sank back onto the blood-soaked floor. She spoke again, but her voice was so soft that he didn't hear the words. He bent to her, turning his ear to her mouth. Tell me again, he said, and this time he could make out the whispered words. His name is Will. It's a good name, he told her. But she didn't hear him. She was already dead.